Code 19 is an observable mathematical design. It's a structure. So what does that mean? For example, if I'm telling you that I'm going to build a house and I want to build this house in a particular way, for example, based on the measurements of 10. So my walls have to be 10 feet tall, and whatever hinge has to be 10 inches, and whatever other thing has to be 10 feet by 10 yards by 10 meters, whatever. Everything's going to be based on 10. And I mentioned to you that I'm going to have a design based on the number 10. Now I have a deliberate design. There's a deliberate structure here. It's not random. It's not even a set of patterns. It's a deliberate design. It's a structure that's intentional. This is the essence of Code 19. So in order to establish that, we have to establish the baseline. Because in order to establish deliberate design mathematically with laws of probability, the most important thing is to establish what we know as consistent methodology. Anyone can go to any book and pick verses that are 19 letters or 19 words or whatever and point out 5 or 10 or 20 of them and say, okay, they're the design in the Quran. That's not Code 19. I see that's presented like that sometimes. The first step when you're presenting Code 19 to anyone, separate from, I guess, identifying that there's a number 19 in the Quran and this kind of thing, is to present the laws of probability, the statistical likelihood. The core of this would go to the Quranic initials. These are the Quranic initials. They prefix 29 chapters. I think there's 30 occurrences in total, right? Because one chapter has 2 sets of initials. Chapter 42 is Hamim in the first verse, and then the following verse is Ain Sin Qaf. What are we looking at a most basic level? There's 29 chapters that have Quranic initials. We have 30 tries because there's 30 verses that have Quranic initials. At a most basic level, we are trying to demonstrate consistent methodology. How are you doing this? You take these letters and you count the frequency of these letters within their respective chapters. Out of the 30 attempts, we are claiming 17 outright are just direct multiples of 19. So for example, chapter 2, verse 1 is Aleph Lam Mim. So we're saying the total number of Aleph and Lam and Mim in this chapter is 9,899. 19 times 521. So we have 30 attempts. The likelihood of any number randomly being a multiple of 19 is 1 over 19, which is 5%. I put a table 4 in the chat. So we're saying chapter 2 starts with ALM, or Aleph Lam Mim. 9,899, multiple of 19. Chapter 3, same thing, multiple of 19. Chapter 29, 30, 31, and 32. These are Aleph Lam Mim chapters, all 6 of them. When I'm presenting Code 19, I want to present the most concise, efficient, effective, and easiest presentation of this miracle. But I'm not going to present a chapter that's not easily verifiable like these, with hundreds or thousands of instances of these letters. I will go, God willing, with the most easiest presentable data sets. So instead of going to Aleph Lam Mim, I'm going to go to Qaf, God willing, in chapter 50. That's where I start typically. In the letters, what are we saying is happening in chapter 50? We're saying that this chapter starts with Qaf. Chapter 50, verse 1. The name of the chapter is Qaf, but it says Qaf and the glorious Quran. It's 2 pages only, this chapter. 2 pages. Within the 2 pages of this chapter, we're counting the instances of the letter Qaf within this chapter. "57 instances. Every instance of a Qaf has a star next to it. So we have 57 instances of Qaf. So with the 57 instances, that's 19 times 3. So now, out of the 30 attempts for the initial chapters, we have 1. We've established 1 that is a multiple of 19. So now you can ask ChatGPT, how many multiples of 19 should I expect from 30 random numbers? And that's what we have. How do we generate 30 random numbers? So there's 29 chapters that are prefixed with Quranic initials. One of these chapters has 2 verses on Quranic initials. That's chapter 42 with Ha, Mim, and Ain, Sin, Qaf. We're looking at the frequency of the count of these letters within each chapter on an individual basis. In order to establish defiance of laws of probability, you have to establish consistent methodology. Consistent methodology is established by showing the same method applied over and over again. So this is what we're doing now. So we have 30 random numbers generated in this way. And I asked ChatGPT, how many multiples of 19 should I expect from 30 random numbers? To estimate how many multiples of 19 you might expect from 30 random numbers, you can start by calculating the probability of a random number being a multiple of 19. Since the multiples of 19 are spaced evenly, 19, 38, 57, the probability of a randomly chosen number being a multiple of 19 is 1 over 19, assuming a uniform distribution of random numbers. For 30 random numbers, you can use the expected value calculation. 30 times 1 over 19, which is approximately 1.58. You should expect about 1 to 2 multiples of 19 among 30 random numbers. So now I'm having a conversation with someone trying to explain code 19 and why it's significant. And I said, look, I have 30 random numbers and I should expect 1 or 2 multiples of 19. We did Qaf. Now I fulfilled 1. So now we move to the next one. The next one is Yasin, chapter 36, verse 1. How many times does Ya and Sin occur in this chapter? 285, which is 19 times 15. So now I've reached 2. Out of the 30 random numbers that ChatGPT has calculated that I should expect, I've reached 2 of them. You can expect 1 or 2 to be multiples of 19 out of 30 random numbers. Okay, so now let's keep going. But now in chapter 42, we're counting the occurrence of Ain, Sin, Qaf. Ain, Sin, Qaf occurs in chapter 42 209 times, which is 19 times 11. So now we're at 3 occurrences. So then we move to another chapter, chapter 19. Qaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad. In this chapter, we use the same system. We count 798 occurrences of these letters within this chapter. That's a multiple of 19, 19 times 42. So now we're at 4 multiples of 19 out of the 30 random numbers. We're getting out of what's expected within the laws of probability. A good example of this is if you flip a coin 1,000 times and then you get heads, you should expect to get heads 50% of the time. Let's say you get heads 500 times. Okay, we expect that. What if I get it 550 times? That's possible. What about 600 times? It's getting a little questionable. How about 700 times? Okay, something's going on. 800 times. Yeah, there's definitely something rigged with this coin. Either there's a miracle happening or it's rigged. Do you understand how I don't need all 1,000 coin flips to be heads to notice something is out of the ordinary, something's unusual? But if I demonstrate that my coin is flipping 700 times heads and 300 times tails out of 1,000 flips, there's something serious going on here. So we established 4 easy ascertainable multiples of 19. We can go further. The other example to give is Noon. Now this is where they can try to dispute, right? Noon is the prefix for chapter 68, the first verse. And it occurs in this chapter 133 times, which is 19 times 7. They may or may not grant you this because Noon in all the Quran versions outside of what we use is written as just one letter Noon. We can make the argument that it should be Noon while Noon because this is a self-correcting code, and also the Quran uses the example in 21:87, Jonah, the one with the N in his name, Noon, the Noon, and it's spelled out for this letter, Noon while Noon. Now what's interesting is in this chapter, the only prophet that's referenced is Jonah in chapter 68. That's in 68:48. It says, "You shall steadfastly persevere in carrying out the commands of your Lord. Do not be like Jonah who called from inside the fish." So he's referenced. That's the only prophet referenced here. And it's ironic that he's known in 2187 as Dhanun. Jonah, the one with the N in his name, abandoned his mission in protest, thinking that we could not control him. He ended up imploring from the darkness of the fish's belly. And there are recitations, as the research has shown, that show this noon as understood as noon while noon. The additional resources put in the chat for the Quran Talk blog article. If they grant noon while noon, great. If not, then we can get to this point where we're saying, look, what we're starting to see is a deliberate design here. ChatGPT says 1 or 2, we have 4. If you grant noon, that's 5. Then we can get into other chapters. If they're willing to play ball, then we can open up the Aleph chapters. These are tricky because the Aleph is difficult to count. But by God's leave, praise God, Brother Peter, he has done a lot of research in presenting these for us. But what I use for the initial counts of Aleph is the digitalized initial counts. There's 13 Aleph chapters. We can visually present these counts. So for example, you go to Aleph Lam Mim Ra. That's the graphic you got from Say the Rejected. Aleph Lam Mim Ra. These letters are proofs of this scripture. What is revealed to you from your Lord is the truth, but most people do not believe. We're just counting these letters within this chapter. And they occur a total of 1,482 times, which is 19 times 78. If someone grants the Aleph chapters, we're at 17 out of 30 random numbers. That's extremely unlikely. That's not going to happen. That it pretty much establishes deliberate design already.
If 17 out of 30 random numbers are multiples of 19, the odds of this occurring by chance are astronomically small, with each number having only a 5.26% chance of being a multiple of 19. You'd typically expect 1 or 2, not 17. Using the binomial probability formula, the likelihood of such an event is so minuscule that it effectively rounds to 0. This defies randomness entirely. Such an outcome isn't just improbable, it's statistically impossible under natural conditions, making this event less a product of chance and more akin to a miracle.
We don't even need 17. I'm happy with 5. 5 would already satisfy beyond probability. The fact that the Quran mentions, and this is an important piece to point out for people, in chapter 74, verse 30, it says, over it is 19. So 19 is referenced in relation to a hidden secret of the Quran. And now we are observing a mathematical book. Once we establish the existence of a deliberate design in the Quran, then the other aspects of Code 19 come into play. Because now we are expecting multiples of 19. So it makes sense, it's expected, it's reasonable to assume that other aspects of the Quran are also going to be multiples of 19. For example, the first revelation of the Quran was the first 5 verses in chapter 96. This is 19 words. The last revelation of the Quran, chapter 110, I believe it's also 19 words. The first chapter revealed, 96, is 19 verses, and it's 19 chapters from the end of the Quran. The first verse of most of the chapters in the Quran, almost all of them, is Basmalah Rahman Rahim. It's 19 letters. And I try to point out the most basic, non-disputed aspects. So I pick from the simple facts. 76 letters of the first revelation is 19 times 4. The total letters of this first chapter revealed is 304, 19 times 16. The first verse of the last chapter revealed is 19 letters. The first revelation is 19 verses. The only aspect of chapter 96 that they may dispute, and they do, is the second to last word of the first revelation is malam. And they try to argue that malam is 2 words instead of 1, giving it 20 words for the first revelation. And a good article on this is presented by Peter, addressing this with additional sources, showing that their own sources recognized malam as 1 word. We have the Quranic initials. Consistent methodology has now been established. These initials already existed. The numbers chosen, we're just going through it brute force, and we're saying 17 out of 30 are straight multiples of 19. That's beyond probability. That already establishes deliberate design. So now what else can we get from this? 2698 is the total frequency of the word God, the most important word in this book. 2,698, which is 19 times 142. That's a multiple of 19. An additional layer to this is the fact that you can add the verse numbers of the cumulative sum for the verses where the word God occurs. And you get 118,123. That's a multiple of 19. Those two facts alone already exceed any human's ability. 7th century Arabia. Nobody could do that. 20 college-educated individuals try to just count the word God and they had different numbers. Just counting. This is structuring and using them in a sentence, and the verse numbers did not exist. Numerals did not exist in the Arabian Peninsula at the time of the Quran. They had numerical values in the form of the letters of the alphabet representing values. These are known as geometrical values or abjad. That means that these chapter numbers and verse numbers didn't exist. They were separated by dots, but they didn't have numbered verses. The numbers came at least a couple hundred years later. So this concept of adding those verses to do some kind of calculation didn't exist. Here I'm presenting the earliest manuscript of the Quran that we have, that we know with carbon dating. This is the Birmingham manuscript. As you can see, without even knowing Arabic, you can see how the verses are separated in the same way that our verses are separated today. They're just not numbered. They're separated by 4 or 5 dots. We have established a deliberate design of the number 19 in the Quran. It's in a fashion that should not be expected within a random distribution of numbers and values, breaking the upper threshold of human capacity at that time. 7th century Arabs. No human being or beings could have done this. So this now establishes, with consistent methodology, code 19 in the Quran. The question becomes, what is the function of code 19? Code 19 does the following. Number 1, it proves God, the existence of God. Proves the Quran is from God. That's number 2. Number 3, it proves the preservation of the Quran, identifies the correct version of the Quran. Number 4, it verifies the new messenger. Number 5, it confirms the practices of submission. We're claiming there's 4 practices of submission. It confirms them. Number 6, it provides the right understanding of the Quran. So do you see how we came full circle? At the beginning of this conversation, the discussion was, how do you justify a particular translation of a verse? And we said, look, we can make linguistic arguments. We have excellent linguistic arguments. We could look at the Arabic, we could look at root words, we could do a lot. But ultimately, everything as a whole is proven because of solid evidence and the validity of God's messenger of the covenant as having divine authority to provide us the correct representation of the Quran, the correct conclusions of the Quran. And the proof for that ultimately is the ultimate miracle, code 19.